Two. Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Crane, and I am the Program Director for the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship. And you are listening to Global Industry Spotlight, a conversational series where we talk with creative entrepreneurs, businesses, artists, and people in the creative industries building amazing things. We are streaming live out of the Comcast Business Startup Studio, a space located in 2112, Chicago's first music, film, and tech incubator. Upcoming event. We have a really big event called the Music Bloom Summit happening on December 3rd. It's our final event of our traveling series for Chicago's music industry and our annual Who's Who in Music Tech Showcase. The event will include a musician's resource fair, music showcases, music tech pitches, fireside chats, and the launch announcement of our CCE music cohort. Again, that'll be Sunday, December 3rd at the Harold Washington Cultural Center at 4701 South Martin Luther King Drive in the awesome neighborhood of Bronzeville. Visit cceglobal.org to register. So, I know that I said that we weren't going to be doing a global industry spotlight, for a little bit, but we had a really, really special email from Danielle to bring these awesome Chicago legends to this program, which I'm really excited. In this episode, we'll be discussing with Andy and Richie Davis about Stony Island, an incredible film that was shot in 1978 that will be shown tomorrow night at 8 p.m. at the Gene Siskel Film Center. Richie Davis, you might know him. He's an American film director. Or Andy Davis is an American film director, producer, writer, and cinematographer who is known for directing a number of successful action thrillers, including Code of Silence, Above the Law, Under Siege, and The Fugitive. And Richie Davis is a Chicago guitar legend who has played with many greats and is also one of the founding members of Chicago Catz. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today.
Glad to be here.
Happy to be here.
So, learning about Stony Island, which I have not seen, but that it was kind of one of the few independent films of its time. Can you talk about just the process of creating this film in 1978?
Well, it was sort of a film that was created out of frustration. I was a young cameraman in Hollywood, and I was trying to get in the union, and I couldn't break that barrier. They didn't want some young guys coming in who would work with young directors who were now getting studio pictures to move above the ranks of guys who had been in the apprentice programs. And so I said, well, maybe it's easier to become a director than to be a director of photography. And so in those days, nobody was making independent movies, very few people.
Right, that's what I read.
So I worked on a bunch of really low-budget pictures and to see what the process would be like, as a cameraman. Horror movies, all kinds of weird stuff. And I said, okay, you can make a day's work done with these many people and this little money. And I said, okay, what's a story I should do? I had seen Mean Streets and I had seen American Graffiti, and I said, these guys made films about their own growing up. I'm going to make a film about my growing up, and I think my brother is a really interesting subject. He was handsome, still is, and he was a young student at the University of Illinois, and he began playing guitar, and he was really getting into the guitar. Mm-hmm. And he had friends in the neighborhood who he wanted to put a band together with, or he sang with, or he played with. So I thought, this is a white kid growing up in a black neighborhood. The neighborhood had changed, and my parents hadn't moved. So a white kid in a black
neighborhood was this?
This is South Chicago. It was called Jeffrey Manor.
Okay.
South Deering, South Chicago, East Side,
yeah.
Mills, the steel mills. Mm-hmm. Tract houses built for GIs after World War II. And so I thought about, trying to tell a story about a white kid making it in a black neighborhood and music being a common language. And that's how the idea came about.
And can you just talk about the music scene at that time? Your interest in exposure to black music, living in that neighborhood. What was that like for you being a young musician?
Well, it's interesting because of the process of redlining, where the neighborhood flips from black to white, there was a certain element of cultural commingling. So initially, most of the black guys who I was jamming with, learning guitar licks from and stuff like that, there were as many guys who were influenced by rock and white artists as there were guys by R&B. So it was really a mixture of all kinds of genres, even though it was becoming a predominantly black neighborhood. So I had a pretty good, I mean, I was turned on like to Johnny Winter by a black guy.
Mm-hmm.
So it, you know, there's a lot of conceptions of, you know, stereotypes of how things seemingly should go, but all these rules were being broken by the serendipity of what that kind of cultural movement is. So, you know, for me, I just was into the guitar. There was always guitars around, and I started to just, you know, go to people's houses where there would be a cheap, you know, Teisco guitar or something like that, and we would just play these riffs endlessly, and it evolved into me learning more and more stuff. And there was a house 2 doors down that sort of evolved into being like a 24/7 funk rock jam session.
Nice.
And I could go there anytime I wanted to and either listen or participate. And I made a lot of friends, and that's where I met Stony Robinson, who is one of the main characters in Stony Island. And based on that relationship, Andy and I were close when I was a little kid, and then he went off to college, and we reconnected around this time, so I'm probably
18, 17.
younger, yeah, probably like 15, 16.
Took a while to get the movie together.
Yeah. And then I was off to college.
Yeah.
And my intention at that time was not to be a professional musician. I remember I had a biology teacher whose brother was in the Independents, which was a pretty successful Chicago vocal group. And he said, "Don't be a professional musician. It's a terrible business."
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny, you know. So my wife's always like, "So our kids, you know, would you be okay if they were musicians?" And I was like, you know, let's push them in another route.
Suffice it to say, I went down to Champaign with the idea of being a biology major,
Right.
but still was passionate about the guitar, and I yearned for, you know, it was a fantasy at that point to be a professional musician. At the same time, the parallel path was Andy was trying to raise money for Stony Island, and it translated to me going for 1 semester to Champaign, but then coming back home thinking that we were about to get greenlit for Stony Island. Well, that process took a couple years. So in those years, I started to really devote my energy to becoming a better guitar player in listening to records, jamming, and even taking lessons downtown from guitar teachers, and spending a lot of time as, you know, a young kid trying to hone his craft, until when we finally started filming, I was still extremely green and far from professional level, but I could, you know, swim with a life preserver at that point.
Yeah.
And I was.
Well, that's how you learn, right?
Right. I could hang with the guys that Andy brought into Stony Island. So that was the beginning of my experience.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. So talk about raising money for this film. So you're saying at that time there was not a lot of independent films. You know, what was the process for you in terms of getting this film greenlit?
Well, I think, you know, in those days, there were maybe some private investors who invested in small movies and got their money back.
Right.
I'm not sure which ones they were, but, you know, and the idea of doing a film about young, attractive kids and music, you know, because I think there had been some big hits, Saturday Night Fever, and there have been other musical films that had done well. And nobody was. We raised $300,000. It was $6,000 a point, and it took a long time to figure out how to do that. We had to get permission from the state of Illinois and from California, and the paperwork, you know, the securities law saying you're stupid, don't put your money in, you're going to lose it all, but sign anyway.
Yeah.
You know, and so we did that. And I met Tamar Hoffs, who who I was a cameraman on a Tony Curtis movie called Lepke, and she was the writer. And we realized that both of our brothers had the same history. Carmi, her brother, grew up in Hyde Park, and he was totally into Muddy Waters and the blues and all kinds of rock. And Richie was younger, but we had a similar story. And I paralleled this to Paul Butterfield and to Siegel Schwall and to Mike Bloomfield, who was in the suburban kid who came in, you know. Mm-hmm. And so it's a history of white kids getting into black music and making it their own, or sharing it and loving it. And then what you have is, you know, like Richie says, you know, there's these kids listening to rock, and so music is a common language, and you know, the idea that you could make a film about that and bring people together.
And you know, and I think this is a really pertinent conversation just for in general of, you know, Chicago culture and how it's progressed or not progressed. And in the 70s, in the music of the 60s and 70s, to me, feels like people were a lot more open in terms of just cultural exchanges, and you had a lot of mixing, and you had groups like the Rotary Connection and Earth, Wind and Fire and all of these, you know, people who were mixing sitar music with rock music and jazz, and I think that still happens today, but you know, maybe not as it is as supported as it was then. And we had just talked about, you know, off camera, how there was during that time, the 60s and 70s, there were record labels in Chicago. There was a lot more industry here. Do you feel, you know, like coming into that scene as a young teenager, was it like, man, there's so much opportunity in Chicago, or were you just kind of like heads down, I need to learn how to play this lick? And
yeah, I had no illusions about that I belonged in that world. You know, through Stony Island, I met guys who were real studio players.
Yeah.
And I talk about this in a different interview, but at that time, when I was a freshman in high school, I remember there was a guy I went to school with, Ron Rollins, who was already a accomplished guitar player, and he had a white Strat, and I thought he was it. And he turned me on to, and I was at that point, I was digging B.B. King and Jimi Hendrix and, you know, that kind of stuff. And he turned me on to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Mm. And because I respected him so much, I got it, and I put the needle on it, and I looked like the RCA dog. I was like,
what's happening?
It didn't compute.
Right.
But because I respected him so much, I forced myself, and it was a learned taste. And to the point where a year or two later, all of the musicians that I was hanging out with, everyone, that was sort of the pinnacle of what being a great musician was. And we were really just posers trying to approximate what that might be like. And what that means is it was tasteless, way too many notes for notes' sake, not the chops to back it up.
Right.
And this is the kind of stuff that we would jam on. And then Andy, and he can talk about how he found Gene Barge, brought in Gene in his studio rhythm section, which for Stony Island Band was Donnie Hagen on drums, Chris Righteous Johnson on guitar, Larry Ball on bass, Tennyson Stevens on keys, and Gene on sax. And I remember them coming into the production facility on Diversey, and all of my buddies were there, and we would be jamming all day long, and no one would pay attention. I think we were probably annoying, but they were too polite to tell us to stop.
Right.
And these guys picked up their instruments, and they started playing the Crusaders way back home. And it was an epiphany for me. And two things happened that I observed. One, all of the staff who had been pretty much dialing us out stopped, and like, they heard real music.
Right.
And I was able to watch high-level musicians play with taste, and observed how they listened to each other. And it was the first time the epiphany was, so this is what it sounds like when you make a record. This is what it sounds like when I hear a song on the radio. I can see it in front of me now. And that one day informed the rest of my career.
Wow. You talk about Donald Hagen, who's getting in the pocket.
Well, everybody, all of these guys. And so that was the biggest gift for me from the Stony Island experience, that was able to later on allow me to become a studio musician, and then in my work with the Catz, because I got to see that it's not about chops, which is nice if you have them. And then still to this day, I suffer from a good amount of imposter syndrome where I don't think I belong. And I would always have butterflies when I would go down to do these sessions with these players that I thought were much more skilled than I was. But I was able at least to learn to utilize my ear and taste and listening to everyone else and creating a part that's part of the arrangement. And I definitely, always refer back to that day.
Yeah.
Stony Island.
Wow.
I connect with that on many different levels. One, just the idea of imposter syndrome, right? I mean, I've definitely sat on the bandstand before, and the musicians I'm playing with that are at a higher level, I look up to, even playing, with Downtown Tony Brown and Herb on guitar, and even Vince Wills coming in playing keys, and and me being definitely the white kid on the
I think
bandstand.
Vince Willis is in Stony Island with. I think he's playing keys in the Faith Pillow scene.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, even just that those moments when you see the real thing,
Right.
and it touches you in a way that you're like, okay, this is what I'm working towards. That kind of musicality, and also me always like watching when I was a younger drummer, watching other drummers who just laid down groove, and I'd be like, oh, that's kind of boring,
Yeah.
And the reality was actually it was way more meaningful what they were playing than being super busy, right? Depending, of course, of what the music was.
And those guys were super supportive and very, nurturing to me. I remember sitting down with the song Percy's Theme, which is pretty sophisticated harmonically, and Tennyson sitting with me and going over it measure by measure. They took a lot of time with me, and it was great to have all these teachers around.
Yeah, and so, Andy, in terms of casting the musicians, we just talked about the musicians that were in the film. How did you approach that? And were there other films that you had seen that you were kind of that you liked in terms of this musical style?
Well, I don't remember when The Commitments came out. Was it after us?
It was after.
After us, okay. I don't know, Hard Day's Night? Couldn't get those guys to be in the movie.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was in a band in college, so I had that experience of, what does it mean to schlep amplifiers and worry about this and that, But we were kids in college. We had a place to sleep and everything at night. Mm-hmm. Well, I started with Richie and Stony. That's the Mutt and Jeff for the movie.
Mm-hmm.
the white kid and the black kid,
Mm-hmm.
who were best friends, lived down the block, and wanted to put a band together.
Right.
And so they in the story they reach out to Gene. Richie worked at a camp up in Wisconsin. He washed dishes for an inner city camp to bring kids from the city out. And the opening of the movie, Gene's there with these kids from the city, he's teaching them how to sing in French and everything. And Richie and Stony ask him, "Can you help us start a band?" And literally, that's what happened. Chuck Stepner, the guy I knew from CBS, who was a producer of their promotional stuff, introduced me to Gene. And Gene was this wonderful, warm guy who had worked with the most amazing musicians who were both rascals, and kind people. And he was able to sort of be a arranger, producer, player within the world of chess and Stax Records.
Mm-hmm.
And when I met him, he was just finishing Natalie Cole's first album, I believe. And the rhythm section, as Richie spoke about a minute ago, were these incredible players. So we had that group with Stony. And then I wanted Will Lee to play this hillbilly character, who was based on Haskell Wexler's kid Harold and Maude in Medium Cool.
Mm-hmm.
And so Willie said, I got this chair, man. If I miss a few sessions, they're going to get somebody else. He's probably right. He was stuck with Saturday Night Live for 20 years or whatever.
Right.
So Tammy knew this kid who grew up in Bel Air, who was Cloris Leachman's son, named George England Jr. George England Sr. was a producer who produced for Marlon Brando and stuff like that. And George was this really attractive kid who could play Sanborn-like saxophone.
Oh, wow. And
Sanborn was a sound that I heard from an album called Taking Off, produced by David Matthews, who wrote a lot of this. He wrote the score. And I convinced David Matthews to do the score. And he brought in Sanborn, and he brought in all these heavyweight New York players. So George England we got brought in. And then Ronnie Barron, who plays the next of kin of Gene Barge, the old sax player. I heard him on a Butterfield album called Better Days. And at first I thought he was black. He did a song called Broke My Baby's Heart, which is a monster song. And I thought, okay, what if Gene Barge, who's going to die in the movie, and they're going to switch the bodies and give a New Orleans funeral to this other guy? What if the next of kin is a white guy? So Ronnie is kind of a strange Spaniard, Portuguese-looking guy who's from New Orleans, who grew up with Dr. John. And he had played with the Animals. And anyway, so I said, Ronnie will be this. So that's how we put these extra musicians together. And then like Richie said, there's a Faith Pillow had a jazz thing. Alejo Poveda did a Latin thing, which with the group came out of the movie,
It
right?
became Chevrolet, yeah.
Chevrolet was a band that started because they had to put a Latin band together in Stony Island. And then Annie Hatt, who was a singer in my college band, I put her with Carmy, Sammy's brother, Nate Herman, and they were the country and western band.
Yeah.
So we just sort of put people together based upon who had certain skills and talents.
And yeah, that sounds extraordinary. And walk me through the premiere of the film and kind of people's initial reactions to it. Where did it premiere?
In Chicago, of course.
Okay.
At the Three Penny Cinema.
Okay.
And we got an award from the governor of Illinois, the Lincoln Award. They made up an award for us.
Oh, wow. So where was the Three Penny Cinema?
Three Penny Cinema. You don't
on
know
Lincoln Avenue.
That's where they shot.
Yeah.
That's where they shot. Who Elliot Ness shot? Who Dillinger in the alley next to.
Okay.
Okay. Michael Mann made that movie.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, no. So the movie opened, and I look at the reviews today, and I go, I can't believe it. The biggest critics in America, Arthur Knight, Charles Champlin, Roger Ebert, Playboy, and then younger critics from like Underground Papers, from L.A. Weekly and stuff. So they said this is a great fresh movie, miles ahead of Grease. Judy Stone loved it in San Francisco. Anyway, so it opened, and it was at the Woods and at Hyde Park and some theaters up north. And I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, but black kids started coming into white theaters to see it. And that was in other places besides Chicago.
That's great.
And the theater owners said, we don't really want these black kids coming into our theater. It may scare off the white trade. And they pulled the picture.
Wow.
So they renamed the picture. My Main Man from Stony Island. Instead of a game, they started a rock band. And they tried to turn it into a blaxploitation movie.
Oh, my gosh. That's... Wow, I
And
did not know
and
that.
this is pre-streaming, so
Right.
This is your only option.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating.
We made a documentary that's available for everybody.
Yeah, it's on YouTube.
AndrewDavisFilms.com,
Yeah.
The Making of Stony Island.
Yeah.
And Richie, we talk about what happened, and you see the trailer and the graphics of what happened. Anyway, so that was it.
Yeah.
It started. Richie became a musician. I continued to be a director.
Right.
And then in 2012, another company tried to do what's happening now. It was a very small operation. And now I got a call from Bill Virgos, who is the son of George Virgos, who was the limo driver in the movie, who helped us get our limos together for the few scenes we needed them for. And he works for Byron Allen, and it's called Freestyle Releasing, and they're going to have it on all the major platforms. So it'll be available in all these seeing it. And it's in Blu-ray versions available, 5.1. Like you can buy it or rent it.
That's fantastic.
The DVD or the movie.
Yeah, and you talked about how that movie, that experience, kind of launched your music career in a lot of ways, right? How was that experience for you in terms of just launching your very successful and incredible, film career?
Well, I guess I learned to be a director. You know, I learned to work with a young Dennis Franz and an old Nate Davis, my father. You know, and Susanna Hoffs and Ray Don Chung were unknowns, and just try to give them a place to find themselves. And this guy and George Englund and Stony, you let them do what you tell them what you think it's about, and you say try to make it feel this way. And most of the time it really worked. So I learned that, and then I think the quality of Stony Island got me the next film, which is a little horror film, with Rachel Ward and Daryl Hannah and Joe Pantoliano, called The Final Terror. And somebody interviewed me the other day who has 4 copies of it. It's like considered a horror film classic.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then the journey's pretty bizarre because Harry Belafonte saw Stony Island and loved it. And David Picker was his partner, and a guy named Max Youngstein put me together with him. And they hired me to direct and write Beat Street, a breakdance movie.
Yeah.
And I did that. And I had arranged for Chaka Khan and Herbie Hancock to do songs they later were nominated or won Grammys for, to be at the Roxy and perform them. But the music supervisor was Arthur Baker, who was the king of hip-hop music in New York. And he was a DJ. And he said, and Harry was gone. Harry was in Sweden doing Deo. And he had hired Arthur to be the music supervisor. And Arthur said, I want all the publishing. We're not using anybody else's music.
Oh, wow.
And there were funny-looking guys coming up the back stairs who said, "Why don't you put my..." And so 15 days into the shooting, there wasn't a click track available on a 30-day schedule. Wow. And I had done a scene where a white kid walked into a place in the Bronx. He looked a little scared, and Harry didn't like that. You couldn't have any white kids looking scared in black neighborhoods, Political correctness.
Right.
He loved Stony Island.
Right.
Okay? So they fired me. And I had a 3-month-old baby, and I was devastated. And I had seen Style Wars, and I was hanging out with Grandmaster Flash and Crazy Legs and all these people, And the head of the studio, Orion Pictures, didn't like David Picker, one of the producers, and Dov Honig, my editor, sent some footage, and they said, this stuff looks great. Why did you fire him?
Right.
Because they couldn't admit they didn't have the music ready. They needed to take a break. So Mike Medavoy saved my life. He offered me Code of Silence, a Chuck Norris movie. I was going to go from a musical. I could have been a musical director.
Right.
And so I became an action director.
Yeah.
And so that film, Code of Silence was a really respected film. It was a big hit. And Steven Seagal saw it, wanted me to do Above the Law. Gene Hackman allowed me to do The Package, And Above the Law went into other things. So it sort of came out of, but if you look at Stony Island, and you look at The Fugitive, and you look at all my other Chicago movies, there's a fabric to them that people have been telling me about for the last week.
Right.
About the reality of the neighborhoods and the people and the look and its style of the film.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard to kind of portray sometimes through film the grit on the walls, like just with the way that you're shooting it. The recent show, The Bear, they've kind of, I think if you would have shot it, it would have been even better. But they've done a good job of representing Chicago without being cheesy.
No, I saw the problem I had with the show was it was so quickly cut.
Yeah.
This heightened reality. It's like, let me slow down and taste the sausage and smell the peppers and get to meet the people a little bit. But it was really well done.
Yeah.
And I look at it and I say, oh, well, they got great fucking shots of the city. They're doing really cool stuff. You know?
No, but I think in terms of a show that kind of represents that edge a little bit, that it does a good job. So
can I just say something?
Yeah. There's
an alternate ending. It's available. It'll be available, I think, on Apple. And in the movie, at the end of the movie, there's a disagreement on how much someone in the band is going to get paid.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. And Richie gets accused of stealing a guitar or a saxophone from studio instrument rentals. He gets fired. He's got to get a job. And he winds up working at the Maxwell Street hot dog stand with the Polish sausages and the steam and the pork. And the footage is fantastic. I think it's one of the favorite images I ever made. Talk about texture.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So for a young musician and a young filmmaker who are thinking about documenting, their journey and their current music state, what would be some of your suggestions in terms of, I'd love to hear from you just in terms of building your music career, and also from you, Andy, in terms of, if you're doing your director debut or wanting to build a film together and you're young and you're thinking, okay, I have this scene, I have this thing I want to capture, what would you feel like is, some of the suggestions you might have?
I just have been lucky. I don't know how I would recommend a career path to anyone these days.
Yeah.
First of all, the music business per se that was still alive in the 80s, I was unsuccessful with.
Right.
It came real close. I wound up in a band with Stoney's brother Stevie Robinson called Third Rail, that we had to change our name once we got a record deal because a band in Boston had copywritten Third Rail. We became Max Tracks, but we were big fish in a little pond. We were a big deal in between 79 and 82 in Chicago. And actually the Numero Group has just re-released the two albums we made. We made one under the name Third Rail and one under the name Max Tracks as a double box set.
It's incredible music.
Yeah.
It's so funky and hip.
But that band, for a variety of reasons, this was just pre-MTV and pre-Thriller. We were too white for the black record companies, and we were too black for the white record companies. And it didn't make it. And, at least in those days, you could sell albums. But now with streaming, these poor young artists have to sell merch, and their tickets cost a fortune to see them live, and they have to be on the road 250 days a year.
Yeah.
So luckily, all the talented musicians that are my peers from that era, there was three options. You could either become a studio musician in Chicago, which at that time meant playing on jingles, which was the foundation for the Catz. All of us, even though we were in Third Rail, Max Tracks type bands, or some of my partners were in, people may know of Big Twist and the Mellow Fellows, or Heavy Manners, a great ska band. We all wound up playing on radio and TV commercials, and that was a nice way to make a living. Or if you were a good enough reader, you could do theater work. There was, when productions of Broadway plays would come into town.
Right.
Or you could move to the coast and try to catch on with somebody, and there's, a laundry list of guys from Chicago who did that, who are my friends, whether it's Richard Patterson or Daryl Jones with the Rolling Stones, Kahari Parker, R.I.P.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys, would relocate and establish themselves. But, in the 80s, nightclubs would hire live bands for dancing. I don't see that too much anymore. It's pretty much a DJ-driven.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough market.
So what the Catz was able to do is maintain. Where the Catz came together was we knew each other from those bands, and now we were downtown every day doing commercials, and when we'd be having lunch, we would talk about, don't you miss playing in front of people dancing? I mean, this is great that we're not starving artists anymore. And I had a pretty bad taste in my mouth from the demise of Max Tracks Third Rail, because guys who were buddies were now starting to squabble over who wrote what percentage of what song, because they were visualizing it was going to be a million seller. And it just poisoned the camaraderie. And I told the guys who were to become the Catz, I said, here's my deal. It's got to be a cover band. There's nothing to fight about. We'll just do the music we like and just have fun. And to make a long story short, the jingle business, the bottom fell out of it in
Yeah.
around 2004. And at that point, we were already starting to do a lot of weddings and corporate parties. And we had also developed a nice niche as a corporate sales meeting bands. We were more like the Roots or the Tonight Show band, where we're playing people on and off pharmaceutical companies, beer companies, that kind of stuff, McDonald's. And to this day, we do a lot of private parties and corporate work and upscale weddings. And, if you had told me that the amount of money that we would charge that we would be getting, in 1979, that I would be in a band that was generating this kind of income, I wouldn't have believed you.
Yeah.
And so, lead a band that does weddings, you can make a living.
Be a very hip,
Yeah.
talented, diverse R&B band who plays the classic things that people love to dance to. Because it's all about people wanting to dance together and have fun and celebrate a wedding.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all the musicians I know, all the top players, and even, I don't know if you know Kevin Conley. But,
Sure.
So he was my drum teacher.
Oh, yeah. Kevin's great.
Yeah.
I used to play in a bar mitzvah band with him.
Yeah, so Kevin, Kevin owned, he had
Rendezvous.
Indigo, and then he
Tony
started,
DiDonato is his wife,
yeah,
right?
so
Good people.
Yeah, I grew up with them.
Wow.
But yeah, the wedding band and the corporate band circuit has been just a great thing for musicians, right? If you can play, it's.
I think the sequel to Stony Island should be the wedding band.
Yeah.
And then the transition is the funeral band.
Right.
Yeah.
That would be interesting. So, I don't want to take any more time. It's really great to learn about this film. I'm glad that.
I'm sorry you didn't see it because you would have incredible questions.
I know I would even have
So
more questions.
are you going to come Friday night?
Yes, I'm not going to come Friday night because I'm not able to make it. But I am looking forward to checking out the film.
Okay, well,
reading-
it'll be available online.
Yeah,
and I'll get you a DVD or whatever.
Yeah, because it's the things that you've already shot. I'm really curious to see this 1978 version, and also to see you as a young musician. And
so the thing is, and just in terms of people who may see this, tell your friends to check out this strange gem of a movie.
Yeah.
I must say so. That's what they're telling me. And the music's cool. It's got heart and soul. It's funny. It's scary. And the other thing I want to promote is that The Fugitive has the 4K Blu-ray coming out on the 21st. And I have a novel coming out next summer called Disturbing the Bones.
Yeah, I read about this. Yeah.
Yeah, and it could be a good thriller. So people can check that out. Also a Chicago sort of based story.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, again, thanks for your time. It's wonderful to talk to you both about the film and the music and the scene in Chicago at that time. I think we could talk a lot longer about all the people that we have in common. And I love Richard Patterson. He's like my favorite bass player to play with. If you ever really want to hear a bass player lay down a Motown groove, Richie Patterson is he's the man. But again, my name is Daniel Crane. I am the program director for the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship, and you have been listening to Global Industry Spotlight, a conversational series where we talk with creative entrepreneurs, people in the creative industries, artists, musicians, filmmakers, about what they have built, what they are building, and it's been wonderful to talk with these Chicago legends here. We're wishing everyone a great end to their week, and we will talk with you soon. Take care.
Thank you.